At 75, most of us hope to be enjoying the perks of retirement and taking things a little bit slower. Well, for NATO, that couldn't be further from the truth. It's been 75 years since the US, Canada, and Western European countries forged an alliance to deter Soviet expansionism, keep peace in Europe, and encourage European political integration. What began with just 12 members has now grown into an alliance of 32 nations. Today, their leaders and partners are meeting in Washington for a summit that will be much more than just a birthday celebration. The challenges facing them are many, some old, some new. Supplying Ukraine with what it needs to fight off Russia's invasion will be top of the agenda. So once again, NATO faces the question of how to contain Russia. But the big picture is more complicated now. Among other issues, leaders are seeking ways to push back against Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran in the Indo-Pacific region. DW's Ines Pohl reports.
NATO was created on a promise. The US and Western Europe would defend each other as they would defend themselves. Their common enemy then, the Soviet Union. After the end of the Cold War, the West seemed to have won, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine more than 2 years ago changed everything. NATO suddenly became relevant again, and its future is now in the political spotlight. When leaders from member countries gather in Washington, it's not just for a birthday party and a celebration of its recent expansion to 32 member states. They'll also discuss changes already taken and those still necessary in response of Russia's invasion to Ukraine. They'll be anxiously looking at America's future engagement, and they'll be also looking beyond Europe. NATO's increased presence in the Indo-Pacific region is designed to defend democracy and protect a region crucial to the global economy. But some say this increased presence will not be welcome.
I think NATO and its member states and other European institutions do suffer from charges of double standards or hypocrisy when it comes to universalizing their mission. And the feeling in many parts of the Global South is that those standards only apply when European security or NATO interests are at stake, but are conveniently set aside when other countries share similar concerns about things happening in their regions and their countries.
Considering the many conflict zones in which NATO is engaged, it's likely to need more money. That makes the question of how American support will look in the future even more important. Some are asking, even if the United States government keeps paying money, will they continue paying attention?
Regardless of who the next president of the United States is, and regardless of what political agenda he or she has, the Americans might focus more on the Indo-Pacific for reasons involving China and other factors. And if they do that, it's not certain that they will be able to maintain their engagement in Europe to the same extent as in the past decades. And if that's the case, if that happens, then we must prepare ourselves for it. That is the challenge we must collectively face in Europe.
And the prospect of a second Donald Trump presidency puts a shadow over all of this.
Well, I think Trump will cause NATO severe difficulties even if he doesn't withdraw, although I think it's more likely he will withdraw.
Outwardly, the summit will celebrate NATO's 75-year success story, but delegates will be wrestling with many existential questions.
And I'm joined now by Rose Gottemoeller. She was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO for 3 years under Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Today, she's a lecturer at Stanford's University Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Welcome to the day, Rose. Now, this summit marks NATO's 75th anniversary. Where do you see NATO at 75?
At 75, I see NATO as a surprisingly strong and coherent organization. It is the, I would say, longest surviving alliance in history, and it has, in recent years, continued to build and develop its strength and coherence in really countering this aggression, helping Ukraine to fight Russia and to push back against Russian aggression in Europe. And so I do think that the alliance is at its 75th birthday in a relatively good spot, at least in terms of its internal coherence and its strength of purpose.
Looking at the state of the world more broadly, and with one of your areas of expertise being arms control, do you think we're now in a more dangerous nuclear situation than we were during the Cold War?
Frankly, it's true that Vladimir Putin has been rattling the nuclear saber, as well as his loyal deputies, throughout this war in Ukraine. I think, frankly, that the greatest, in some ways, threat has passed. There was a time in October, November of 2022 when the Russians thought they were losing and they seemed to be ready to pull the nuclear trigger. But now they seem to be they think they're in a better situation. So although they continue to threaten nuclear use, I think in the end of the day that they feel more confident in their conventional capabilities now, and they're playing a waiting game also. They think that time is on their side in this war.
You were the first, and to this day only, woman to serve as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. There has never been a female Secretary General. I want to know from you, because you know the alliance from the inside, you know the structures. Is NATO still a boys' club to this day?
Well, I hope I won't long be the first and only Deputy Secretary General of NATO who's a female, but we'll see what happens. There will be a new Deputy Secretary General selected at the same time that Mark Rutte is assuming his post as the new Secretary General. So I think it's a good moment to think about who the next one might be as a female. But you know, it's interesting. I have seen a big change in NATO even in the time I was there. I think when I arrived in 2016 in October, yes, NATO was still significantly a boys' club. But in that time, and I give Jens Stoltenberg and his Assistant Secretaries General full credit for this, they have really pushed hard to bring women into not only the top leadership of the organization, but where it's important to change the culture, and that is into middle and lower management levels as well. So I really do think that NATO is in a better place than it was in 2016 when I arrived.
What are the effects of giving more women a seat at the table at a place like NATO, a defense alliance?
I think that having women at the table in any event brings a different problem-solving dynamic. Women don't tend to get into the same zero-sum standoffs that men can sometimes get into when they're butting heads. Women are willing to look around for ways to bring the temperature down and to try to find a solution that makes sense for everybody. They're also very good at bringing a lot of stakeholders to the table and making sure that everybody is satisfied, so that in the end of the day you don't have kind of attempts to undo a decision in the back offices and in the corridors. So I think in many ways having more women managers at NATO at every level has helped the alliance to be a better organization.
Now that you mentioned stakeholders, many of them are in Washington this week. What's at stake for the alliance and its partners at the summit?
I think really the resolve of NATO is the big question on the table, the resolve to continue its assistance to Ukraine front and center, but also the resolve to continue to move into the future, because there's a lot going on in innovation and technology. There's a lot of developments we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine in terms of the use of drones and so forth. So many changes occurring in how war will be fought in the future, and NATO needs to stay ahead of that curve. So technology and innovation, how will NATO adapt? How will NATO continue to move into the future as an effective military and fighting force? This is going to be a very important aspect of what NATO is working on as well at this summit. And it's a big challenge because it's expensive. It requires those investments that some NATO member states have been reluctant to make in the past. They're doing better now, much better. But nevertheless, it will be a big resource investment in future.
Yeah. President Joe Biden hosts this summit, and he does so under intense scrutiny. How big a role do you expect the discussion about his fitness for office to play at the meeting?
Well, You know, Joe Biden is our most experienced politician, in my view, and over the years he has taken an enormous amount of interest in foreign and defense policy. So he is also very experienced in terms of the NATO agenda and in terms of what is a priority for NATO. So I do believe that he is certainly, in terms of his experience and knowledge, he is very fit and ready to continue that leadership role. Of course, his age has been a huge question in our election campaign. It really burst even more onto the scene after the debacle of the debate with Mr. Trump a couple of weeks ago. But I do hope that members will find that the president is focused on the issues that matter to them and also the issues that matter to future strength and coherence of NATO.
Do you think NATO allies and partners are right to be concerned about Biden after all these episodes that you just named?
I think it'll be up to President Biden during this summit meeting to convey that he is, as he's said time and time again, ready to carry his presidency forward into a second term. And so he's going to have to make that case to the allies. There's no question, because there are many, many questions on the table. So he's going to have to answer to those concerns. And I think he will be able to do so, but a lot depends on what else is happening in the world these days. And these days there are pressures arising from all directions, referring to the terrible attack that the Russians perpetrated on a children's hospital in Kiev. I'm expecting and worried about more such mischief as the summit unfolds.
Yeah. Now, whether or not he'll be able to reassure partners, there are serious doubts about whether he'll be able to beat Donald Trump. What would a second Trump term mean for the alliance?
Well, you know, I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO during Trump's first term in office, and I saw him during several summit meetings at NATO. He was unrelenting, clearly, in pushing the alliance to spend more, the allies in Europe and Canada to spend more on their own defense. And they had committed at Wales, the summit in Wales in 2014, after Putin invaded Crimea, they committed to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And so Trump was unrelenting. Pressure was very high. But to be honest with you, Secretary General Stoltenberg, my boss, and I felt that it was important that the president was pressing this point. American presidents from Jack Kennedy on have said that the allies are freeloading. They need to be spending more on their own defense. The United States cannot carry the burden alone. And so that message in some ways was very welcome. So I say Trump got the momentum going during his first time in office. I think he'll be pleased now that more allies have stepped up. 23 out of 32 allies are now spending 2% of GDP on defense. That's because of Putin and the threat he poses.
Yeah, but he's also made remarks along the lines that countries that don't reach that 2% kind of a goal would be, in a way, and I'm paraphrasing here, a fair game for Russia. Where does that leave NATO as a whole? Because that defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Well, Trump says a lot on the campaign trail that I don't know if he would bring into office with him. If you can say anything about Donald Trump, he is unpredictable. But I think it's going to be up to the allies, those remaining 9 allies who have not reached 2% of GDP, to really get themselves into gear and work to approach that level, because the allies are also agreeing at this summit, interestingly, that 2% is not a ceiling, it's a floor. And that all allies need to be prepared to spend more on their own defense and go beyond 2% of GDP. So there's not going to be any space for the laggards, essentially. And I think that will have to be a very strong message coming out of this summit. As for Trump's threats that we would have a kind of two-speed alliance with some countries, under the protection of the Article 5 treaty commitment to defend them should they be attacked, and others not because they haven't spent enough. This is a recipe for tearing the alliance apart. So I think it's an idiotic idea, and frankly, it's going to be something that the allies are going to have to, I think, work hard to address should Trump come back into office again.
Now, we are celebrating, or NATO is celebrating, the 75th anniversary this year. 75 years from now, do you think NATO will still exist?
Well, 75 years from now, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if all the principles in the UN Charter were equally embraced and agreed by every country around the world, and there was no more aggression and no more threats to sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I would hope for that nirvana to appear, but I kind of doubt it. So yes, I think there'll be a role for NATO 75 years from now, and I think it could come into that at that point 150th birthday as strong and coherent as ever.
That was Rose Gottemoeller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for making the time.
My pleasure.